Okay. So the structure of this talk is like the famous film A Christmas Carol. You're going to be visited by three ghosts, very briefly. The ghosts of think tank past, present and future. So the birth of the think tank, Leonora has talked about this already. You know, in the 1800s, most UK think tanks that are still around today come from the 20th century. Brookings is obviously a kind of massive institution in the States, has a very long history. ODI is the oldest think tank here on the panel. I thought it was worth mentioning NEF, the New Economics Foundation, because they emerged in the 1980s and they sort of challenged the think tank model. They called themselves a think and do tank. And then IPPR, who I work for, which I guess by the sort of mid-90s was known of as Tony Blair's favourite think tank. And people at IPPR had a great kind of existential angst over what would happen post-Tony Blair, but 25 years and IPPR is still going strong, and we've sort of reinvented ourselves several times and are still going. SMF obviously hosting today and has a very political beginning to its start, founded by David Owen when he abolished a political party, the SDP, and merged it with the Lib Dems, with the Liberal Party to become the Lib Dems, and created a foundation to keep the ideas and ideology going. SMF obviously think of themselves as a non-political think tank now, but it's interesting, on Wikipedia they're still described as John Major's favourite think tank. Who would have thought that they would win Think Tank of the Year, you know, almost a decade after John Major went to the political wilderness. And then I just thought I'd mention Guerrilla Policy, who are quite new on the scene, probably the newest think tank, I think, on the scene. And I mean, this is a question, really. I should put a question mark. Does Guerrilla Policy sort of represent the death of the think tank, where we look back and think, you know, they were ahead of their time? Guerrilla Policy are interesting, though, because they say on their website, one of the questions is Guerrilla Policy a think tank? And their answer is, we've worked in and around think tanks, so that's how we tend to view the world, but we've decided to call our project something other than a think tank, especially because few people know about think tanks and what they do. I think it's interesting that even an organisation which kind of wants to signal the end of the think tank is not kind of confident enough to say, well, we're not actually a think tank, but we don't really like the think tank model. Anyway, we'll come back to these existential questions a bit later. I knew Leonora would mention her awards, so I just thought I'd show off ours. IPPR is the only think tank to win Prospect Think Tank of the Year twice.
Tenuous.
Yeah. Next slide. Okay, think tank comms past. So, yeah, I have spent a decade working in think tanks, and I joined IPPR just after we won Think Tank of the Year first in 2001. And obviously we won it again in 2007, which I take huge credit for. But in the past, think tanks, I think, were structured very much around... I mean, this was the structure of the comms team when I joined IPPR. There were people who worked on publications and our website. You know, we were a charitable... Well, we remain a charitable publisher. We publish research. We used to do it in hard copy, and we sold copies of those reports. We didn't give them away free. And so our website was like a sort of, you know, like our version of Amazon or something, but in a very crude way. We had an events and fundraising team, but most of our events were dissemination events for our research. A lot of them were invite only. They tended to be panel discussions, and almost all of them were in London. I have to say, when we launched IPPR North and became the first London think tank to open a Newcastle office, that changed. But still, I think you know, the past of think tanks is characterised by events in London. And then I came to work in the press office, and the thing about IPPR's press coverage is, you know, there was a decent profile when I arrived, but every journalist I spoke to said, well, we really like IPPR stories, but we always read them first in The Guardian, so we're not going to bother following up from Guardian exclusives. And on broadcast coverage, we didn't really get any further than Today and Newsnight. Now, I think it is still true that the Westminster Village wakes up to Today and goes to bed with Newsnight and doesn't really consume broadcast media much in between, except through media monitoring and cutting services, where ministers are mentioned or policy areas are mentioned. So one other thing I just wanted to talk about was the idea that newspapers might be dead. You sort of hear people saying print is over and all stuff like this. And obviously, newspapers and print are the past, but I'm sure John is going to talk about this a lot more. But it seems to me that actually newspapers are just becoming a new offer. They're taking their brands online. So yes, there's been a huge decline in newspapers over the last 10 years, and there's some figures there. Telegraph, The Guardian broadly halved their circulation of their newspapers, but The Telegraph and The Guardian obviously have massive digital audiences which are growing and growing by the day. And you may have heard this fact before, but I just still think it's funny that Owen Jones has more followers than The Independent sells copies. Why does he bother writing a column in The Independent? Probably for the money, but if he wants to tell his 100,000 followers something, he could just post a blog on his own website. He doesn't need The Independent to do that. And I think the number of journalists who write for newspapers who have more followers than their newspapers sell hard copies is going to increase more and more. So the same has happened to the red tops and the middle market. The Express in 1964 was the biggest selling newspaper in Britain, and now it isn't. This is an amazing fact to me, but the FT has more digital subscribers than have ever bought the paper in the paper's history, which again I just think is fascinating, and it tells you something about newspapers not being dead. So what is the present? What is the present of Think Tank Comms? What are we doing, or rather, what are Leonora and I doing while Nick's sort of moved on? Well, a big thing about media relations, I think, for think tanks at the moment is, the best think tanks are the ones which have a sort of political position or orientation or historical attachment to a sort of political movement, which are able to get coverage in newspapers and outlets which have a different political persuasion and orientation. So, IPPR is a centre-left think tank. If we get coverage in the right-wing press, I'm a lot happier than if I'm giving all my stories exclusive to The Guardian. It might be easier for me to get coverage in The Guardian, but is that the name of the game? I think you're just preaching to the converted. The other thing about media coverage is this is something I started in 2001. I came to Think Tank as a government press officer, having used the government communications grid, and I just kind of thought, well, I know where the gaps in the government's grid are. Why don't I try and fill them from my think tank? And after a decade, I think it's time I shared this technique with the rest of the world. So I will show you our planning grid in a moment, a later slide. Trailing as well. So we used to spend 6 to 9 months working on a 100-page report, and we might announce the project at the start, and then the researchers would go off and bury their nose in books and disappear into libraries, and you wouldn't hear anything about that report until we dropped it from a great height, and a 100-page report with 50 recommendations appeared. Now, we communicate throughout the lifetime of the project. We trail stuff before we publish a final report. We get more than one bite of the cherry. I'll show you an example of that as well in a minute. And then the other thing is, well, you can create a lot of profile, you can get a lot of coverage, you can be a high-profile think tank, but is your coverage really helping you to change the world? Think tanks really, what distinguishes them from academic institutions is that they campaign for change, or they come up with ideas that change things. They don't just think for the sake of thinking. Good media relations, I think, it contributes to that, doesn't just raise your profile. And then blogs, obviously lots of people started their own blogs. I think Demos, Greenhouse blog, which was a source of great amusement to many of us in the think tank world at the sort of turn of the millennium. They were well ahead of their time in terms of being the first think tank to create a blog. I also remember Georgina Henry ringing me up at IPPR and saying, look, I really need to come and give a talk to all your staff at IPPR because we're setting up this thing. It's going to be called Comment is Free. And I'm really worried that no one's going to write for it. So I need to come and she did. She came and she urged all our researchers to write interesting things for Comment is Free. And now, as you know, Comment is Free is massive and it's really difficult to get stuff in there. But the idea of using guest posts on other people's blogs where they've got massive audiences, I think has taken over from the idea of set up your own blog and try and build your build your audience. And then Twitter, obviously, we're all on Twitter now. Some of us live on Twitter, for our shame. But I think the big thing about Twitter is that although our corporate handles tend to have the biggest followings, actually the best stuff gets done if you can get all your staff on Twitter and you can get them using their personal handles to get kind of specialist audiences. So, you know, if you've got a specialist on climate change in your organisation, get them on Twitter because they'll get lots of people who are interested in climate change following them, whereas your corporate handle, if you're a general think tank, it's harder to get that range of specialism. So the more people you get on Twitter, I think you're more than the sum of your parts if you mainstream Twitter and get the whole organisation on. Right, here's an example of trailing. So I don't know if Gary is here. Is Gary Ray here from Joseph Rowntree? He registered. No, he hasn't made it. Okay. But I think we have got JRF colleagues in the house. So I don't know if you can see this, but I just spotted this interaction on Twitter, and so I just screen grabbed it. So here's Nick Faith from Policy Exchange bragging about getting coverage in the Sun. I do it on a daily basis. I think I did it this morning. We're in the Guardian and the Mirror, if you have a look at my Twitter feed. And then Gary says, that's really interesting. Can I read your report? And Nick says, well, the full report isn't out until the end of the month. We're trailing the findings today. Gary says, okay, thanks very much. And he probably goes off and he thinks, right, what can we trail? You know, this is an example of people trailing, getting more than one bite of the cherry, breaking stuff up. You know, don't just, I mean, you may have thought about every aspect of housing policy, but you're not going to get an article that covers every aspect of our housing policy. So break stuff up. Right, here's a copy of our grid. I've actually got the physical version here. The government grid has a week on a page. And so it has, you know, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday as columns. So it has 6 columns because it has the weekend as one. And somewhere at number 10, there'll be a, you know, Lisa's smiling at me. There is, isn't there? Somewhere at number 10, there's a 52-page document of this, I think, that has, you know, every single week for the year. But of course, what they circulate to everyone is just 2 weeks in advance because the grid notoriously leaks. But at your think tank, you should set up your own grid. I would do a month on a page because I don't, with the greatest respect, I don't think you'll have enough content to fill a day on a page. So this is a real screen grab of IPPR's grid for last December. And the reason I put December up is because it's a really interesting month because it shows you why you need a grid. So the first 2 weeks of December are the really busy weeks on the government grid. So those 2 weeks are all the announcements that everybody's been working on through the autumn and into the winter and absolutely have to be completed by Christmas. And officials have got that in their mind as their deadline, and you know, ministers want to get it out before Christmas, before they go off skiing or whatever. And so those 2 weeks are really busy for lots of government announcements every day, multiple government announcements. Do not bother publishing your reports in those 2 weeks. However, the following 2 weeks are brilliant times to publish your reports because the government is not churning out anything. You know, Christmas and New Year, the gap in between, from Boxing Day onwards, those weeks are brilliant weeks to publish reports. And if you have a grid, you can plan that in. And IPPR every year tries to do 4 or 5 embargoed stories. We call them our Christmas hamper. And journalists are so delighted to be contacted by us in the last week before the Christmas holidays, and we say, I've got 4 embargoed stories for you to keep you ticking over through Christmas. And it's, you know, it is like delivering presents from Santa. And then you just find that your stories get in loads of papers, you get tons of content. And okay, even if everybody's away on holiday and no one's reading newspapers, which I don't believe anyway, because I do actually believe people do read newspapers over Christmas holidays because they're on holiday. So they read papers, whereas the rest of us read papers for our job. So we think that's what you do at work, and then we don't read papers over Christmas because we're taking a break. But normal people do it the other way around. Okay, so but even if you think, well, no one's reading newspapers over Christmas, cuttings, you know, it goes in the cutting. So when the minister comes back after Christmas, if you've got a load of coverage on their policy area, it's in their cuttings and they see it. And it's like you've sent them a personal memo. So that's how the grid works. Coverage, different types of coverage. So IPPR is thought of as a high-profile coverage, high-profile think tank. I take that very personally, and I'm very proud of it. Katie Schmucker, I know, is in the audience, who now works for JRF, but there she is on Channel 4 News. There's lots of people from IPPR. We get loads of coverage all the time, and I like that. But that's not why IPPR is influential. However, it does help with fundraising. It does help with people's general kind of perception of IPPR, but you do not change the world through media coverage. This is how you change the world. So we tell our researchers, look, getting some headlines is step number one. It's very hard to change the world if you can't get any, if you can't create headlines. But that is not where it ends. That is where it starts. You need to start a debate. You need to get people discussing the ideas that you're putting out there. And housing for us, and particularly a shift from housing benefit into house building, has been a debate that we've tried to start. And hopefully I'm going to show you a video later which will show you how we've tried to get that debate going beyond getting the headlines. And I refer you to yesterday's Evening Standard. Again, you'll find a link on my Twitter feed where Liam Byrne, in an interview with Evening Standard, is talking about this IPPR idea. So really that's like point 4, provoke politicians. You know, they've noticed, they've started to talk about it, they're feeding it back. Point number 3, you know, we work with Shelter and other sort of civil society or charity campaign groups who campaign on this issue. I think think tanks and campaigners are a brilliant alliance, because a really good think tank, it does campaign, but it's not seen as a campaigning organisation. And a really good campaigning organisation is probably not going to have that much in-house capacity to do hardcore, heavy lifting, serious data research. But if you get these two organisations working together, or these two types of organisations working together, you get something very powerful. And then obviously at the end of the day, you want, you know, our strapline at IPPR is ideas for change. You know, it's the change at the end that matters probably more than the ideas. And usually it's government that implement the kind of ideas that we work on. But not every think tank it will be targeting ideas for change to government. So whoever it is, that's who ultimately you're targeting. Right, so what about the future? Well, it's an existential question, the future, because it depends what you think is essential about a think tank. You know, and I go back to NEF, I go back to guerrilla policy. Is now the time to kill the think tank? Is the think tank dead? I don't think so. And these are some of my propositions that I think should guide us into the future. If you don't buy into these propositions, the rest of this presentation will not be of any interest to you at all. So I think think tanks are elite projects. I think they always have been, and I think in some ways they always will be if they're going to do what they do best. That doesn't mean you can't work with campaign groups as well, but don't try and reinvent yourself as a campaign group, because then you'll just be looking around trying to find a think tank to fulfill the elite end of your change project. Even leading think tanks don't lead, we follow. So some people think of IPPR as a leading think tank. We do not sit around in our comms team thinking about what we can do first. We sit around looking at what everybody else is doing and copying the best stuff and adapting it to ourselves. So honestly, what we're trying to do is nick ideas from other sectors and bring them into the think tank world, and that's how we get our reputation for being a leading think tank. Having said that, you know, authenticity is everything. This is the kind of key insight that I think has swept through politics since probably the MP's expenses crisis, if not a little bit before. You also find it in America and kind of all the Obama campaigning stuff. Authenticity is everything. Don't try and pretend to be something you're not. Social media exposes everything, so be authentic from the start. Don't get exposed. You know, I won't go into transparency on funding, but I think it's worth being transparent about your funding. And then finally, the sort of insight that is sweeping the private sector, and particularly through marketing at the moment, is the idea that consumers won't find products, products will find consumers. And I think there's something that we can learn from that, which I'll come back to. So what to do with this? Well, I like to think of think tank products as a sort of pyramid of engagement. And what I mean by a pyramid is at the very top of the pyramid is the very superficial stuff. So, you know, retweet my link to a research paper that I've spent 9 months working on and is 50 pages long and has 24 recommendations. That takes you half a second. That is a very superficial sort of bit of the pyramid engagement. However, print out, read my report cover to cover, come to an invite-only event that I'm going to host in London that's very exclusive, where you might get coffee and croissant and a bit of, you know, insider high-level chat. That is a very deep level of engagement. That takes hours and hours and hours. And I think think tanks in the past were very good at that bottom bit of the pyramid of engagement, the very deep level. You know, here's a long report, come to an exclusive event. And I think think tanks at the moment, in the present, are very good at the top end of the pyramid of engagement. We're all using Twitter, we understand links, we're writing summaries, we're even writing blogs. But I think there is a massive, massive gap in the middle of the pyramid of engagement between the very short stuff at the top and the very deep stuff in the middle. And I think you fill that by creating different types of digital content, which hopefully I will show. This does raise a staffing problem, though, not least at IPPR. You know, I talked about our staffing structure. We still basically have the same. You've got 3 types of specialists: people doing publications and web, people doing events and fundraising, people doing media relations and press office. Who is going to do the 4th element, which is what we call it at IPPR. We call it the 4th element. And it's our code word for this is not in anybody's job description, but we know we need to get it done. And it's digital content, it's social media, it's infographics, animation, film, video, citizen journalism. And we have fantastic interns who are doing it for us right now. We're not training people up, we're hiring in the skills. We pay London living wage, so we're hoping we're not exploiting them. And I think they get the opportunity to work in think tanks and have some experience. ODI is you know, fabulously endowed with people like Nick and other digital specialists. But you know, for Leonora's think tank of 8, where she has to do most of the comms herself, it's quite difficult to think that she's going to be able to hire a digital specialist. You know, not going to have room on the most think tanks are not going to have room on the payroll for someone who just does digital. So I think the rest of us need to learn. Now I'm going to try and show 2 examples, if Leonora lets me. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as they're quick.
They'll be quick. Okay. So this 2 1-minute clips. So the first is I'm going to tell you about them as I pull them up. The first is an animation which
Chrome.
That one?
No,
The Chrome one.
No, maybe it's not. I think I'm in Chrome. You're in.
No, we are. Okay, I'll show you this one first. So this is from the Centre for American Progress, and it's on YouTube, but you'll see that it's powered by Prezi. It's by the chief economist, and I'll just show you the first minute of this, but you'll get the idea. And then the next one I show you is very different type of digital content.
We believe in an America that says our economic strength doesn't come from the top down, it comes from the middle out, it comes from the bottom up.
In the last election, President Obama made something called middle-out economics a central part of his strategy to grow the U.S. economy. But what is middle-out economics, and how is it different from the failed supply-side or quote-unquote trickle-down economics of the past 30 years? Why does the president agree with economists who believe we need a strong middle class in order to have strong economic growth? I'm Heather Boucher, senior economist at the Center for American Progress. In the following presentation, I'm going to explain how a stronger middle class is the engine that can power our economy to grow faster and to create more jobs. So let's begin. As you all well know, there's a big debate going on in this country about how to make our economy stronger and
Right, so
more
we won't
stable.
listen to her argument, okay?
While it
But
may
just
seem
know that the next
sometimes
6
like
minutes
the
of
various
this kind of
sides
carries
don't
on
agree
like
on
this,
anything,
basically. And I think you're going to see a bit more
economists
Prezi
actually
later
do
on
agree
today
on some things.
from Nick's presentation.
For one
So
thing, they generally agree.
that is digital content. You can imagine that Heather has, behind this somewhere is a 100-page report that Heather's written about that explains middle-out economics. But she's made a 6-minute digital film using Prezi that's going to show you lots of her kind of key statistics, and it's very whizzy, and I think fills a bit of the gap in the pyramid of ideas. Right, let me try and show you the next one. So this is an IPPR animation. It's actually the first one we've made. We've made 3, but I think the first one we made is the best because we just stumbled across this. It doesn't have any it doesn't have any talking in it. It's just music, but there are words and graphics, and again you'll see kind of images. And this is what Liam Byrne was talking about in the Evening Standard yesterday. So what to do with this? What to do next? The reason I showed those two videos is they're different ways of doing the same thing. They're different ways of trying to fill the middle bit of the pyramid of engagement. And the first one I think is probably going to be more acceptable to the researchers who work in your think tanks. And the second one I think is probably going to be more rewarding for you to work on. When I say we made it at IPPR, we didn't actually make it at IPPR, we commissioned it. In some ways it's a 60-second spot ad for the product that we produce, which is research. Whereas the second one, I think, you've got the researcher, their voice is presenting it, but it's kind of moving PowerPoint in some ways. I think it's a format they're more comfortable with and probably more accepting of. So what to do next? Right, these are my final thoughts. Don't try and lead, emulate, don't try and invent, steal other people's ideas. Not least from us, and join the community of practice that Nick, Leonora, and I are setting up, and steal our ideas. Make yourselves look amazing in your own organisations. Be early adopters rather than first movers. I mean, honestly, Demos were the subject of ridicule at IPPR when they produced their greenhouse blog, and I don't think it was the only place either. It doesn't mean it was the wrong thing to do. It's just first movers, I think, are not maybe as successful as early adopters. I mean, another example of IPPR versus Demos, I should declare an interest, I have worked for both these organisations, is that Demos were the first, I think, onto Twitter, first users of Twitter, but we've overtaken them in terms of our corporate handle with Twitter followers. I think actually IPPR owes a huge debt to Demos because we've stolen all their ideas and done it better. But I think that's I think that's the model you should try and use. Right, now this insight from the private sector that customers won't find products will find them in the future. So, they might be talking about hair care products and they might be thinking about those products finding people on Facebook or whatever, which is fine. But actually that is the old school philosophy of think tank media relations. That's what I was doing in 2001. I was not trying to get a piece in the Daily Mail to summarise our report on housing. I was just trying to get the attention of the housing minister through the cutting service. I was trying to get our product to find them. I wanted that minister to come in the morning, read the cuttings and shout at the officials, IPPR have published a report on housing. Go and read it, find out what it says. I want to know about it. The product was finding them rather than them finding the product. So I guess my top tip is to experiment. It's crucial that you measure and evaluate. I wasn't going to do a slideshow on measuring and evaluation because it's dull, but you have to do it, obviously. And try and evolve and get into stuff quick, but also get out if it doesn't work. Don't say, right, we're gonna plough the Facebook furrow for as long as it takes or whatever. There may still be think tanks who are on MySpace, I don't know, but if you'd gone down that road, you'd regret it. So just get in, but get out even quicker. And in some ways, I think the thing about the future of think tank comms is it is kind of back to the future. Don't forget everything that you've learned in the past. Just try and use the new toys, but stay true to what you've been trying to do for a long time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. Lots of food for thought there. I should have said earlier, we're going to have plenty of time for questions and discussion because we obviously want to get everyone's views in the room, and also people who are watching via the live streaming and joining in via Twitter. So don't worry, you will get the chance to have your say. Also, before I hand over to Nick, I just want to take the liberty of giving you an example of a piece of think tank communications that's been very effective for the SMF. An online piece of communications that we've done on a very kind of low budget. So this is our... this one, yeah? Yeah. So this you may recognise from last night's Newsnight. It's a map to the growth debate in the UK, and it's not any kind of interactive infographic. It's simply a PDF document based on the remarkable insights of our director Ian, who's over in the corner there. And I just made it on Publisher. So Publisher's free, and I put it together in collaboration with Ian, put it into a PDF document. We got lots of interest in it via Twitter. It's retweeted by people including Evan Davis and Paul Mason, and was on Newsnight last night. So I suppose the kind of message there is it doesn't have to be expensive. It can be low rent and it can still be effective. But if you are a big think tank and you have a digital communications manager, you can win digital strategies, and Nick's now going to talk about that.